Oh god, I think this monster is a representation of Boogie 2998. We opened this week with Homura and Diesel establishing their new independent business on Earth, starting with a little advertising. Yeah, Kenny Omega wants to have a word with you two. Meanwhile, the best characters in the show were also taking on some new ventures of their own, working at a restaurant where, for whatever reason, no one batted an eye at the fact that they were being served by a monster couple. Granted, their one customer was a little depressed, having lost his love interest all the way back in the first episode of this show. Yeah, and an actually rather clever callback, Norio, the guy Mira was supposed to elope with, was back and hadn't quite gotten over losing his lady. I like this because, of course, we kind of forget that this guy was even a thing because, well, he was barely in the first episode, so we wouldn't expect him to return, and yet it also makes perfect sense they would because, of course, he wouldn't be able to just get over it like it was nothing. Anyway, if he would want to consult with anyone, he would, of course, go with the villains of the show, who, as we learn later in this episode, were purposely looking for guys like him by covertly taking over this restaurant, and yes, I am using some very big finger quotes. But yeah, finding a guy who actually had out for the Boonboomger was fortunate for them, as after creating a miso soup monster, they let him personally control it with a steering wheel. How would you be able to operate a bipedal humanoid creature with just a steering wheel? Well, obviously the same way you would a giant butler robot. Seriously, I would kill for an HD of that. Hell, I would even put up with premium Bandai just to get it. Also, interestingly enough, this monster was voiced by Satoshi Tsuruoka, who for this franchise previously voiced Dogold from Kyoryuger, but for Fate fans like me, we know him for playing a bunch of servants, including Castor from Fate Zero, and, well... So, after some absolutely charming moments, like Norio joining in on the Hashiran pose, they launched the attack with him looking for his pink waifu. And he of course found her when the Boonboomger arrived to deal with his monster, and after doing a failed recreation of Sazai-san's opening... yes, there's nothing like taking a bath in some salty broth that's often made with some boiled seafood. I mean, some people are into that, but we don't talk about them. Noticing that the monster was receiving remote signals, Taya decided to look for its controller. At the same time, his teammates were trying to save Mira, but Joe was stopped by the physics of steam pressure.
It's science.
Fortunately, Homura managed to stumble upon Norio, with Taya quickly following up. And this led to an actually really good scene, as we learned a little bit more about Mira through the accounts of one guy's very rose-tinted glasses. He claimed that she was a very easily strung along girl, which she certainly was, but also clearly failed to realize that he was guilty of doing just that to her by proposing to her out of nowhere. Of course she couldn't just say no to the poor guy, but there were also more than a few signs that she wasn't totally on board with it. Thus, even though the guy she was forcibly going to get hitched to for political reasons was the legit worst choice, he was hardly any better, at least based on the idea that he was a bit of a control freak, and was currently a quite literal example of such. I know this season doesn't have the strongest ongoing plot, especially compared to last year, but I still really appreciate it for strong character moments like this. And hey, at least this show has a consistent antagonistic presence. Not naming any names, but... And to further hammer home this whole message that no one has a right to steal someone else's steering wheel, Mira finally woke up and tried to get out of her salty prison. This led to Norio, rather symbolically, losing control over her and his monster the more he tried to assert his will onto her. With that, Homura decided to do some cleanup and managed to dislodge Mira from the monster. Personally, I just heard it a few times and eventually it opens. Understandably, kind of being peeved over the whole being trapped against her will thing, Mira just went all out on her captor, who without a proper controller kinda defaulted to Norio's most base desires of wanting to control Mira, which made the guy himself realize that he had been more than a bit of a putz, as he had already seen Mira's strong, independent attitude. Because while he probably had some good intentions in the first episode, he had clearly also forgotten why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. With that, we then got a fairly standard giant monster fight. Nothing really notable, other than the usual good application of mostly practical effects, which actually did make them batting away these miso soup bowls legit kind of impressive. However, yeah, it is also pretty obvious that we're still waiting on the new upgrade for the mid-season, which does look legit pretty damn sweet. Regardless, the episode ended on a rather strong note, with it rather poetically recreating the end of the first episode, only now with Norio being able to walk away happily after realizing that no one could or should control Mira except the lady herself. This is a good example of an episode that we weren't really asking for, and yet we always kind of needed. I mean, while it's not uncommon for Super Sentai to call back to previous episodes, I can't really think of many examples of ones that go all the way back to the very beginning. And yet, it kind of made this episode all the more effective, as it was back to the basics to remind us of some of the major themes of the show. When you get down to it, Mira has kind of been the low-key main protagonist of the season. Yes, obviously Tai gets most of the action, and as we'll see next week, most of the upgrades like any Red. However, I don't think he's supposed to be the most relatable character, much less the audience surrogate. For that, we've had Mira from the very beginning, who in some ways, as Norio put it, had been swept up by everything going on around her. And yet, that didn't necessarily mean that she was just on autopilot or anything. Everything she had committed to was of her own volition, and while she often did get in over her head, she still saw things out to the end. Be it decorating a sign for their school, or fighting a monster who treated her like an ingredient for a soup. In a way, I guess you could also consider her to be a bit of a cleaner, which made her somewhat forced team up with Homura all the more appropriate, and yet also pretty hilarious. But yeah, this episode had some great symbolism in it, with Norio quite literally trying to take control over Mira under the ironic pretense that he was saving her from being manipulated by others. Yeah, him realizing what he had been doing to her and how much she had grown without any intervention from him was quite satisfying. Sure, he did justifiably hire Taya to save her from a far worse fate, but he also needed to realize that her future from that point on was her own, and as clearly evidenced, she made the right choices in the long run. Just some really good storytelling that made up for the fact that this was kind of filler, though I also get the feeling like we'll see Cannonborg's controller again soon. And overall, this is just a good Mira episode that, ironically, didn't actually feature her a whole lot, and yet through some solid storytelling, we were able to get a good sense of how much she had grown since the very beginning of the show. Clearly, she had gotten a good handle on her life, though let's just pray she doesn't go over the speed limit. So, after a couple weeks, I think we finally managed to settle on a proper video review schedule for this summer that really should keep us busy. We'll keep releasing Sentai reviews on Sundays like this. Tuesday afternoons, we'll do VTuber Legend with a mini review of what we were supposed to originally cover with the Magical Girl and Diva Lieutenant. Wednesdays will be our usual alternating reviews of Doremi and Battle Spirits, and finally on Thursdays will be Nokotan. Honestly, it has just been fun to cover some new shows every season, so we'll probably keep this up at least until the end of the year. So do look forward to it, and until then though, for now my friends, and if you excuse me, I'm kind of in the mood for some miso soup myself. Get in the pot! Get in the pot, damn you!